Well, folks, thank you for the chance to share a few thoughts with you this afternoon as part of your afternoon agenda. I'll try to be pretty brief, but I wanted to just discuss a little bit with you in terms of the value of manure and trying to find that win-win for manure. You know, I think historically we've always been talking in terms of manure. How do we avoid it becoming an environmental risk or an environmental hazard? And I really think we need to be changing the discussion because manure has the potential, I think, and we recognize it being a win from a fertility side, but it can be certainly a win from the soil quality, soil health side. And if we do things right, I think it can actually be a win from the environmental side. And I think we have the opportunity, if we think about those win-win situations in which we utilize manure, that we should be able to change that perception that manure is an environmental risk or it's an environmental loss and change it to that manure actually become an environmental win. Okay, so my hope today is that I can get you to think in terms of those fields around your livestock or your swine operation and which of those fields really produce that win-win opportunity, a win from a fertility perspective and also a win from the soil health, soil quality perspective and possibly from the environmental perspective. So not all of them are going to be win-win situations, but where are those situations where that win-win can occur? Okay, so let's just quickly remind ourselves there are benefits. I think we recognize many of those. Certainly we recognize the fertilizer substitution benefit that can come from manure. The regulations that changed in the early 2000s forced some of us to think in those terms, and I think over time many of us have begun to recognize that value that was there that sometimes we didn't always utilize. I think we've yet to fully comprehend organic matter value. I think those of you that have been utilizing it over the past several years maybe are more aware of it, but I want to spend some time thinking in terms of that organic matter or that carbon value that comes with manure. And I think expect that some of you are seeing yield increases if you were to compare manure alongside more of a commercially fertilized situation. So these are benefits that I think we can all take advantage of. I'm going to spend some time talking about the first two today and seeing if we can't help for both the first two, identifying what are those win situations. Just a little review. I think many of you are aware of this, but in terms of the fertility benefit, where we'll spend our time on first, a nitrogen perspective, there is both that organic nitrogen side of this that we can take advantage of. And really, this is an ideal form of nitrogen because it becomes slow. It's available slowly to the crop and mainly during the cropping season. As that soil warms up in the spring, you begin seeing that organic nitrogen moving into an ammonium form and becoming plant available. But if we put that organic nitrogen on fall, late fall, winter, it pretty much stays in that immobile form of organic nitrogen, not until the following spring as things warm up that it becomes available. And of course, this is something we're often, when we put commercial fertilizer on, we're often asking, is there value of slowing the release of those commercial fertilizer? And that happens naturally through about half of that nitrogen in swine manure. The other half is ammonium nitrogen. It behaves essentially the same as our commercial nitrogens. It's important that if we're going to take advantage of it, that we do have to get it mixed into the soil almost immediately. And it's readily available to the plant, and it behaves very much like other commercial nitrogen forms. We also recognize there's phosphorus, maybe not always in the right ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus, but there's a fair amount of phosphorus, and often a single manure application can provide us sufficient phosphorus for 2 more years. And if we need it, there are other nutrients, potassium and a number of micronutrients if that's of value to our soils. So all of these are potential wins It's a matter of whether we take advantage of those forms in looking at our fertility program. Okay, now what I'd like to do is just take a quick look at some typical forms that we store our manure. And I think it's important to recognize that choices we make during storage have a fair impact upon the value of those nutrients. I'm just going to show 4 scenarios here: the deep pit, and I'm going to put that alongside of a deep pit where we use a type of feeder that may conserve the amount of water that's getting mixed into that deep pit. And if you do a little bit of comparison across those 2 columns, you'll notice that at second column, the concentration of those nutrients are higher. So our inability or our ability to keep water out of that manure does have an influence on the concentration of those nutrients. In some ways, the value of that manure. We store that manure outside. The elements of, the rainfall that dilutes some of that manure, some of the microbial breakdown that occurs in those outdoor pits cause that to have less value. And if we put this into an earthen structure, such as an anaerobic lagoon, where we're really trying to encourage that microbial activity, it may have some benefits in terms of odor and things such as that, but it certainly causes us to lose a fair amount of the nutrient value of that manure, either as ammonia that's volatilized from the surface or as the phosphorus that settles out, as well as the dilution. So as you begin asking questions about the value of manure, it's always important to look at the specific situation and look at the specific manure that you're harvesting out of your storage structure. So that individual analysis for your farm becomes very important. But I'm going to just take this second column and I'm just going to make some generalizations about the value of manure for this second column here. This particular graphic is an effort to estimate the value of manure kind of on a low end and a high end, a lower estimate and a higher estimate. And the situation I set up for these 2 scenarios is the lower end, I'm giving value to the nitrogen and the phosphorus, no value to the potassium, a little bit of value to the micronutrients. And I'm using this year's fertilizer prices from right before the Christmas period. So probably lower than we've experienced over the last several years. The higher estimate, I'm using a higher fertilizer value, something that's been more typical over the last several years, and also added the value of potassium into that scenario. And as you can see here, we're looking at values ranging from about $30 per 1,000 gallons to close to $60 per 1,000 gallons. So if we were to apply this manure, let's say at a nitrogen-based rate, which would be roughly in the ballpark of about 3,000 gallons, we're looking at a per acre value of these manures, depending on whether you're on the lower or the upper end, between $90 and $175 per acre. Now, look at the individual contributions within each of those circles. And I'm sorry, my ammonium on that high value, that shouldn't have been that way, but I think you can get the perspective of kind of the relative value. Certainly, I think the first thing you need to recognize that we're going to get a significant value from manure. We've got to be utilizing the phosphorus. We've got to be applying it into cropping systems where there is a value to that phosphorus. We'll talk more about that in just a second. And the same is true from the ammonium. If we're going to get value out of this manure, we've got to be capturing that ammonium value. It's very significant in swine manure. We're turning around and doing the same discussion for some of your neighbors that have beef cattle feedlots. That ammonium value would be very small compared to the phosphorus and the organic nitrogen. But for you folks, capturing that ammonium nitrogen is very important to getting significant value. So really trying to get a significant win out of the manure from a swine operation is dependent upon our ability to utilize or capture value from the phosphorus and the nitrogen. If we have a situation where we have fields that can use potassium, Certainly that begins to add some additional value. It's still not quite as large as phosphorus and ammonia, but it's significant and important. So that gives you some understanding of, if you're going to capture this value, some of the things that we need to consider. The last message I wanted to share in this topic is simply, you really, especially if you're doing this for your own farm or a neighbor where you might be transferring manure to, do some calculation of this for your own situation. These scenarios that I set up, you can see that wide range of values, and you need to really do this for your own. There are some resources out there. This NEB guide will help you do that. There's an associated, I'm going to skip by that. There's an associated spreadsheet that will allow you to do the calculations. And if you're wanting to find those resources, simply do a Google search on Nebraska Manure Value Calculator, and you'll get some resources that will help you do that for your particular farm. All right, where I want to conclude this discussion of the win from the fertility value of manure is to give you some reminders of what are those situations where you're going to get that greatest value, where you could be closer to that $175 an acre value. Certainly from a phosphorus standpoint, we want to target those fields that are low in phosphorus, where we get a value this coming year from adding that phosphorus to the field. And that would be fields with less than 20 part per million P in terms of the soil sample. Fields that we delay returning to that same field for 1 or more years until we utilize that phosphorus and possibly that potassium that we've put on. Because many times if we're applying close to that nitrogen-based value, we're applying 2 or 3 or more years of phosphorus in terms of the crop needs. So after that first year, continuing to watch that soil P level, when it drops back below that 20 part per million, that's the time when returning with a swine manure application is going to get you the greatest value. Certainly from a nitrogen perspective, we want to conserve that ammonium nitrogen. I'm guessing that many of you already do that. That's not new news to you. And certainly if we're going to have dollar value from that, we need to apply that ahead of a non-legume crop. And then the last is targeting fields that might also find value from a potassium perspective, sulfur or zinc deficit that might give you some additional value to that manure. So that's the win. Those are the kinds of situations where you're going to get the greatest win from the fertility value of manure. Probably not a lot of new news there. I think just a reminder of some things many of you already know. Now, I'd like to spend some time now on the organic value and just share a few additional thoughts along this side. And I'm going to borrow from Iowa State, from an extension publication. It was written actually in 1907. And notice some of the words that I'm highlighting in the green lines there. We realized many, many years ago the organic value of manure in addition to the fertility value. It permanently improves soil characteristics. It improves it by changing the physical properties of the soil. It increases the water absorbing and water holding power of that soil. So many years ago, we were recognizing this. I think in many cases, my generation, and you can't tell from my little picture here, but I don't have a whole lot of hair on my head, and what I do have is pretty darn gray. So when I refer to my generation, you can see what I'm referring to. I think many times we forgot about that organic value of manure. So let's spend just a minute reviewing a little bit of that organic value. Certainly, we know that if we add nitrogen or manure to a field, we're adding organic matter to that soil. Now, what does that mean? First thing I think we need to recognize is organic matter or carbon really is the energy source for that microbial community in that soil. That microbial community, to be healthy, to be active, needs energy. And manure is an outstanding source of that energy. It creates an environment that you'll see a greater diversity of the soil microbiological community. You'll see a soil that is able to better mobilize nutrients from some of the more immobile form, and its ability to produce, change the soil's physical characteristics that will have benefit to you too. So manure is going to increase that soil microbial activity, and that is extremely important to the health or the quality of that soil. One of the things that results is the production of these polysaccharides that creates the aggregation of soil, providing those aggregate components of soil that are so essential to these kind of benefits, to greater moisture infiltration, less runoff from a rainfall event or precipitation event, and less erosion. Now, those have benefits to you in terms of making that soil just a little bit more drought resistant by gaining more moisture access into the soil and holding it. And it has benefits to the environment, less runoff and less erosion. Now, just to share an example of this, and I don't have an example to share using swine manure, this is going to be with composted beef feedlot manure. And just very quickly summarize a little bit of research that went on in here in eastern Nebraska between 1998 and 2006. They went through a 3-year period applying that composted manure to these fields, 1998, 99, 2000. And here is the soil erosion and the runoff during the years that the manure was applied, that crop year immediately following. Look at the runoff and the erosion. It was 1/3 of the runoff and erosion from a site that was commercially fertilized. Everything else treated the same, roughly the same yields, but the runoff and the erosion was 1/3 during the years in which that composted manure was applied. And there was a residual effect over here, the blue bars. That residual effect was monitored for a 4-year period. So last manure application in the year 2000, we're still seeing effects out as far as 2006 in terms of reduced runoff, reduced soil erosion, benefits to the environment. Now, the actual phosphorus that moved from this site was higher, even though we had less runoff, less erosion. And that was because we applied manure 3 years in a row at a rate that was probably almost 10 times what that crop needed, because there wasn't a whole lot of nitrogen in that composted feedlot manure. So we produced some pretty high soil P levels. So we really didn't help the P losses from this field, but we certainly did reduce the erosion and runoff. We kept those P levels at a more manageable level. We might have even helped the environment from the phosphorus runoff also. So bottom line, I think what I want you to take out of this, organic matter in manure has some real huge benefits to the soil in terms of its physical properties, its biological properties, its ability to recycle nutrients, and the immediate impact to you, a little more drought tolerance, less runoff and erosion. And if we're able to keep the soil phosphorus level at the surface at a reasonable level, I anticipate we'll see situations where the soil P levels, the runoff from soil phosphorus is even less. So some real environmental benefits. So I think there's situations we can talk in terms of manure not being a detriment to the environment, being a plus to the environment if we look for those win situations in terms of how we use that organic nitrogen. And here's some of my thoughts on what are those win situations. Target fields with lower organic matter, target fields that experience crusting after a rainfall event or higher rainfall or higher runoff, target fields that you don't seem to see much biological activity. Maybe the one way to kind of tell that is fields that you don't see earthworms, and then fields that commonly experience ponding or drowned out areas. There are soils that are not infiltrating moisture well, and higher organic matter can benefit those. Oops. So I know my time's running out. The one thing I did want to share with you, I think the one thing we need to keep in the back of our mind is the odor nuisance, the community nuisance that comes with manure. And if we can successfully manage this, I think we can make manure a win-win in a lot of its situations. Certainly, the best way to avoid this is the same-day incorporation. We can get that manure mixed into that soil immediately. Odor risk is going to be pretty minimal. If we can't move it into the soil, I think there's a lot to be gained in terms of looking at a weather forecast and identifying if the period ahead of you over the next 3 or 4 days, if there is a high risk of odor to your neighbors or low risk. And the situations that are high risk are when we have cool air temperatures or early morning hours, temperatures dropping, or cloudy conditions combined with low wind speeds. Yeah, those two combinations, as suggested by these arrows, that's when our neighbor's at risk. And so if that occurs, we need to be looking at the wind direction when that will be occurring and recognize if I applied manure here the day before, my neighbors to the west of me are going to be at high risk. So do I have a neighbor setting to the west? And if I do, that application of manure the day before may not have been a good idea. So if you have to surface apply manure, looking at these weather forecasts that give you wind speed, wind direction, temperature, I think can give you some real inclinations. When do you have a good window for applying manure, and what fields could you apply manure and successfully avoid those community nuisances? I think I'll stop there. I had one more idea I wanted to share, but I think it's time for me to draw this to conclusion. So thank you, folks. I do have to
give an overview of the livestock development matrix here in Nebraska, and hopefully spur some questions if you have any on the matrix, and you can get back to me at another time with those questions or ask them at the end here. So an overview, go through a little bit of background. I'll have some summary statements, basically my perspective. We'll walk through quickly the main sections of the matrix, and then I have a couple comments specific to pork producers. So in terms of background, in May of 2015, LB 106 was passed, and that legislative bill called for an act relating to zoning to provide for a committee and an assessment matrix. So the bottom line is the state is looking for a more consistent process applied across counties in which to consider and approve applications for livestock expansion. And when this bill was initiated, it was proposed as mandatory across counties. When it was passed, it was voluntary. And so that made a big difference in our activities. In October, the committee was selected. We met regularly for about 6 months, and in June we put a draft out for review. By September, it had been reviewed, and we finalized the matrix and turned it over to the Department of Agriculture. And they now, as of beginning of this year, 2017, have the matrix ready for use. A little bit about the committee. There are 10 committee members, and 4 of those are highlighted in bold as representing pork production directly. Many of you know Mark Mahard and Sarah Pillen as industry reps. In terms of county planning and zoning, Liz Dorr is a pork producer or family pork operation. John Suker, consultant, but also involved in pork production. And then you see the other members there representing a variety of interests. So I have 4 summary statements. These are my views on what the matrix is. And the first one is that it's a useful tool that was pretty much developed through committee consensus. So what I mean by that is we met several times, and by the middle of the second meeting, it's pretty obvious that what people had envisioned individually this might look like, matrix might look like, it was going to be different than what we had each thought of initially. But with the collective thoughts, and it was a good working group to be on, we came up with what we believe is a good, useful product. Second statement I would make is that if I was going to give a car analogy for this, the driver of the car would be animal agriculture, and the designer of the road would be named town hall. So what I mean by this is it was pretty clear that if there were 2 or 3 options to pick from, the option that was favorable for animal agriculture would always get selected. And so the committee was just in tune with animal agriculture from that perspective. There were several places, though, that the county perspective or the community perspective just put up some boundaries, and it became quite clear that certain things that some of us had in mind were not going to fly at the county level in terms of implementation, whether they were too complicated, just not science-based, or would cost too much for the producer, or whatever the reason was. At some point, some things were put boundaries on. The third summary statement is that looking back, what the matrix looks like is very close to what was actually outlined in terms of LB 106. This is a little bit unique for me because when the committee was meeting, we very seldom, actually we're referring back to LB 106. We came in with a pretty open mind, open slate of things we were looking at, and through the process, and things get tossed out as unworkable or unreasonable. At the end of the day, it does follow pretty closely what was guided to us by LB 106. And the last one, I would say that the bottom line is the matrix is designed to foster AFO expansion that meets basic criteria without having any undue processes there. So think about that as if an application comes through the county, to the county, and it satisfies NDEQ's requirements on the water quality side, and it meets the county setbacks, and then the other things are, the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted, that application should be approved. And so that is the main, when you go through the matrix, that is the main thing that should come out loud and clear. Other kind of extreme situations, the matrix is probably not very well equipped to handle those. But the baseline ones, that something that looks like an apple and should be approved as an apple should go through without any other strings attached. So just walking through this rather quickly, we spent a lot of time on each one of these, but in terms of livestock operation size, it's just documentation of what's there, what's proposed. So I'm going to walk through with an example of a 4,800 head swine finishing operation, deep pit in this case. And so that would be just documenting the number of animals and the animal units. No points are assigned for being big or small. Next main section is environmental protection. And you'll notice that there's 2 titles on a lot of these sections. The one with a letter in front of it is the title that the committee gave it. The one underlined, in this case NDEQ status, is what Department of Agriculture named the section. So basically, we're looking at environmental protection plans, and there was a lot of discussion as to whether we should even have this section in the matrix. There were some pretty divergent views here. On the one side, some people thought that this is all DEQ's domain, and the county shouldn't even be looking at this. And on the other side of the perspective, there were several people who thought that, well, the counties will be in a lot better position if they know what protections the DEQ permit is providing. And so actually there was for a long time, points were assigned based on each one of those individual plans that you see in lines 3 through 17. At the end of the day, it was somewhere in the middle where there's disclosure of what the protections are provided in their permit, but the points are basically assigned whether or not DEQ will sign off on this and provide a permit or an exemption. Section C is probably the most contentious one. I won't have enough time to go through all this, but I will lay it out. At the end of the day, it became very clear early on that the setback of the county was going to have to rule the day. We would like to be informed how those setbacks are obtained, but at the end of the day, the committee came to the conclusion that we were going to have to base this on whether or not the application meets the county setbacks. And so the points, the 30 points maximum that you can get is all provided if you meet the county setback. If you don't meet the county setback, or an application doesn't meet the setback, you can get some partial credit or dig yourself a deeper hole in terms of losing points based on the number of residences or public places in the area and the location of those residences relative to wind direction, prevailing winds, and things like that. So bottom line is that the setback is the way to get, meeting the setback is the way to get full points. There are ways to earn back some credit if you don't meet the setback. Section D is environmental compliance. Basically what this says is people who have been in business and have had a clean record should get some credit for that. Section E looks at water quality protection of the facilities. And we had quite a bit of discussion on this. Basically what I would say is this is primarily for disclosure and transparency. So most of this stuff is already given value in the permit, but not all applications will need a DEQ permit. So this is one way to lay it out there for the county that this is what is provided in terms of protection, and give some points for the level of protection that's offered. Not a lot of points in this section, and we were comfortable with that. Section F looks at odor and dust control. And so you'll notice that in my example, I don't have any of these identified. And so what I'm trying to do is pick a more common situation. But this list of 9 technologies that could be adopted, and in reality, there's 9 options there, but in reality, people would maybe implement 1 or 2 of these at the most. So one of our thoughts here is that we're probably undervaluing the real benefit to these technologies, but we didn't want to assign a lot of points to these given the low adoption and acceptance rates and probably high cost of the technologies, and risk the counties mandating them. And so it's still innovation, it's still progress, but we didn't want it to get to the point where a lot of points is tied into this, what we would call optional practices. In terms of manure application practices, Section G, basically what what this is looking at is based on your manure handling system and how that would be applied. If you're handling manure as disposal, you will lose points. If you are managing manure in whatever form properly and taking advantage of what you can, you have the opportunity to actually gain a few points through manure application. And it kind of goes back to, we know that properly managed manure should have value, even to the environment. And so that's how this shakes out. A lot of people I know have, on the farm side, have said they don't like the idea of starting out with a negative. But if you look at it and try a few situations out, I think you'll see that if all you're doing is applying surface applied slurry from an air and water quality perspective, that would be a risk. And but if you manage it correctly, you can get back to 0 or a positive number. In terms of manure application separation and buffers, these are things that we wanted to come across as optional, and my example shows that. But there is we know there is some value to having buffers and additional separation distance. We just didn't want this to come across as becoming the new standard. Section I is additional assurance of environmental protection. For those operations that may want to need more points or want to have more full disclosure, if they're willing to openly implement their management plans, then they are available to get additional points. Section J is traffic. In our discussions, we know that traffic is very important, and so there's greater opportunity to gain points or potentially lose points in this section. And I think most of these, we had a lot of discussion. We fleshed a bunch of them out, and the ones we kept, I think, make a lot of sense in terms of value to the community and making sense to livestock operations. Section K has to do with where the people who have responsibility or are in charge of the operation live relative to the operation. We had a lot of discussion on ownership here, and that pretty much fell out. But we retained the idea that the person who's in charge of making critical decisions and the person who is managing the day-to-day activities, and they may be the same person in some situations, but those people, there's value to them being closer to the operation in an emergency or if a community concern comes up. Communication is very important. We just made it a one-line issue. If you communicate with your neighbors within 1 mile, you get 5 points. Economic impact was required to be considered, and so we consider both property tax value and job creation, but the value assigned is not sufficient to offset some deficiencies in siting or environmental management. So that was our main consideration there. Landscape and aesthetics are also important at the county level, but we tried to winnow that down to the ones that we thought mattered the most and not have the point values be too high. So at the end of the day, earning a passing score, you need a passing score of 75. 30 of that would be from NDEQ. 30 of that should normally be from meeting the county setback. And then you need 15 points from other areas to get a passing score. And you can see with my example here, just did the basics, no deficiencies, no black eyes along the way, and I get a passing score. So I got to highlight what I think is the most important summary statement I've made is that the matrix is really designed mainly to make sure that those applications that meet the NDEQ and the setback requirements are approved without a lot of extra strings attached or undue process. Just a couple of final remarks for pork operations. Separation distance for odor are based on not the species, but or the number of animal units only. It's number of animal units and the form of manure handled. This for swine generally means liquid manure, which is generally the larger of the setbacks. This has a research basis, and other species systems don't have that research behind it. So that if anything, their numbers would go up, would be my expectation. And the other one is that overall, I think we were cautious in our approach to innovations and extras being considered in the industry when we look at a county zoning perspective. So I'm going to stop there and see if we have time for questions, or if we just move on and go from there.
The session this morning I wanted to leave you with is this idea of presenting a plan to your county for expansion or establishment of a new animal feeding operation. And I think, you know, we heard some very good information from Dr. Stowell and Dr. Koelsch about some of the science behind the different manure application practices and management practices. I was really glad to hear the overview of the matrix and how different aspects of that were arrived at, how the point systems were arrived at. Probably the thing that comes out the most in a situation where a producer is expanding or proposing a new operation is less about the science and more about the community acceptance or the interest of the community in having that livestock operation there. And so I guess I would start this discussion with thinking about what's important to your county. Every county probably has an economic development plan. They have some idea of where they see that county going. Maybe it is they want to expand the schools. They want to improve infrastructure in the community. Some counties will have a plan to increase agricultural production, whether that's by livestock or processing facilities related to animal meat and other animal byproducts. I think most counties, when we talk about rural development, are very interested in attracting citizens to the community, whether those are new families moving to Nebraska, or maybe another generation that has left the farm or left the community to go to college or to work in a metropolitan area, and trying to attract those folks back to rural Nebraska. And then finally, you know, increasing tourism. Some areas of the state are very popular for hunting, fishing, water activities, things like that. And so, you know, for some counties that might be a main priority. But I think in order to approach your county, you need to know what's important to them. What is that county looking to change or to do in the next, 10, 20 years. So once you kind of understand what your county is looking for, I think the next step is to think about how your operation might benefit the community. So if increased revenue is important to the county, certainly you can talk about the revenue potential, the tax base, the opportunity to create jobs through livestock production. I think a really important message is talking about the idea of supporting youth or young people returning to the county, and livestock production might be, the only way that they can do that. And I know a lot of producers will talk about expanding in order to bring a son or daughter back to the farm, and maybe it's a cooperative agreement where the son or daughter comes back and produces pigs and provides the manure to mom and dad for use in the crop fields. The reality is a lot of young people can't afford to come back and purchase land for crop production, but they may be able to purchase a smaller acreage where they can raise pigs, and they can have some sort of a cooperative agreement with other family members on utilizing that manure in their cropping system. I think another good point to make when talking with your county officials about how you might benefit the county is the financial support that you intend to provide for existing county businesses. So whether that's through construction, dirt work, the folks that would do that sort of work for the construction of an operation, banking and insurance needs related to the operation that could come from the community. And I've heard producers talk as well about, manure application. They built a new swine facility, and they didn't have the manure application equipment, but someone down the road or in the community did. And so they've contracted with that individual to haul manure for them. So I think there are a lot of ways that, that producers can demonstrate how they intend to support other businesses in the community through their livestock operation. So I think once you kind of understand what your community wants and how you feel your operation can benefit, the next step is to think about how you share that information. What kind of information you should share with your neighbors, with county officials, with other members of the community. So we've heard some discussion about utilization of manure, the value of manure. I think it's important to go into those conversations being able to explain that you know exactly how much manure to expect from that operation. You have an understanding of the total nutrients that will be generated. You know how much land that will take, and you maybe own 50% of that land, but you have agreements with neighbors for applying manure to additional land to meet those needs for nutrient management of this new facility. I think you need to talk about your manure storage system, both from a water quality and an odor or air quality perspective. And I'll leave you with some links to tools that we have available for assessing those sorts of things. But going into that conversation with an understanding that most folks are going to be probably a little hesitant about this idea of manure, this large amount of manure being stored in land applied. And so being able to discuss the pros and cons of the system that you've selected, I think is an important conversation piece. You should be prepared to talk to them about the manure application practices that you intend to use. And again, from Dr. Koelsch's presentation, we heard about the nitrogen availability, the value of that nitrogen, and application methods that conserve nutrients and reduce that opportunity for losses to surface water. And so that would be something to include in that discussion with the community and with neighbors. Maybe talking about mortality disposal. Perhaps that means giving a little bit of background on why there will be mortalities on a farm. Some folks may think that's a sign of a poorly operated system, when in reality it's a normal part of operations. And talking about how that what disposal methods might be used on the farm. For air quality protection, being able to share that you've run through the odor footprint tool and share the results from that, so it shows that you've considered the various aspects of how you might impact neighbors with odors generated on the farm. Again, manure application methods come back to the air quality and the odors that could potentially come from that site. Talking about your building design, the management plans that you intend to implement, and again, mortality disposal from an odor perspective is important as well. Talking with neighbors, they are probably going to be interested in hearing how you've selected this site and how it will impact them from an odor standpoint. Being able to discuss the Livestock Siting Assessment Matrix that we just heard from Dr. Stowell about, and explaining how you the different aspects of that you intend to implement on your operation and how those score essentially on that in that matrix. Communicating a plan about manure handling, so assuring them that their activities and would be considered when you apply manure, that you would notify them ahead of time and be considerate if they have plans that would be impacted by manure application. And then talking about transportation, like, if there are alternate routes that don't take your feed trucks and your livestock trailers and manure handling equipment by neighbors' houses on a regular basis, that can go a long ways to satisfy some of those concerns that neighbors have. And then some other general considerations, talking about what expectations you have for the farm manager and the employees for how they'll interact with the community and how they'll manage the animals. Inviting neighbors and other community members and county officials to visit your site, look at your plans and how you intend to lay out the facility, or taking them to a similar site. There's plenty of operations, I think, in the state that would welcome visitors to come out and at least see how that farm is laid out and maybe get a firsthand perspective of the potential for odor and nuisance issues. I think it's important to demonstrate your commitment to the community. My perspective is that communities are much more welcoming when it's one of their own who is maybe returning to the community or expanding. That's not always the case, of course, but having that personal connection to the community, I think, is very important. And then I also mentioned biosecurity plans. So, for instance, if you are one of many swine operations in the county, considering the proximity of your operation to other swine operations and how you might impact their operation, I think, is an important discussion to have as well. So I want to leave you with just a couple of resources. This is a new website that we are just getting launched today, actually. It's called Ag Site Planner, and the URL for it is agsiteplanner.unl.edu. Some of the aspects of it are functional and others are not, but will be coming soon. The one I'd like to draw your attention to right now is the critical questions related to livestock expansion. So if you go to the site and click on View Resources, you can find a lot of the information that we talked about today and some of those critical questions that you need to be thinking about if you are planning to expand a livestock facility. There's a regulatory guidance tool that will be available soon, and the intention here is that you can walk through a process to identify regulatory requirements based on the operation type and size and based on the location within the state. There's a risk management tool that will be available soon, and the intent here is that you select a geographic location, either your existing farm or a proposed site, and it generates a report that identifies potential environmental and social risks associated with that site. The risk management tool, again, would allow you to identify potential environmental and social risks associated with a proposed site. And then at the bottom, you'll find additional resources, and these take you to some of our existing sites, the Livestock Siting Assessment Matrix, Odor Footprint Tool, Livestock Friendly County Program, etc. And then one last resource I'd like to make you aware of. We did a series of webinars last summer that were related to livestock and poultry expansion. And those webinars are all archived. So the URL is at the bottom of the page here. And if you go there, you can see the topics that were presented, who presented those, and then you can actually view the archived webinar for those topics that are of interest to you. And then the speaker contact information is shown for each of us. So email or phone number if you want to reach out and ask questions that we don't get to today. So with that,